Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the Trinity, one in essence and undivided.
This is going to be what, session number 3? Is that correct? I believe we're going to be on page 35 in your book, if you're following along with your book. Perhaps it's helpful. What we've done so far, and the reason why, let me remind us we're doing this, because I know it's summertime and some of us are not here every week and so forth. We're going to be looking at, and the goal, of course, is the liturgy. We are going to get there. But in order to get there when we're there, we have to do some stuff now, because if I started there, then we would have to come back and do all of this to explain what we're talking about there. If that doesn't mess you up. The Divine Liturgy is Mystagogic. I'm not going to say much more about it. We're going to get there. And when we get there and on our way there, we are going to discover some stuff. And I'm going to illustrate this now because it's fresh. We have people almost every day, certainly weekly, that come to the church wanting to learn about the Orthodox faith. Today we had 2 separate couples come. I think Sally was here when one of them came today. The first lady that came was a mother with 2 children. Her husband was at work. Chatted for a while that she was interested and had been studying up on the Orthodox faith, etc. I invited her to our classes the next time we start them up in August. She asked whether it would be okay if they came to a worship service, and I said of course, and then I explained she would be totally lost and it might be helpful to take the classes first, and we would discuss stuff then. But I wanted to show her the sanctuary. Now, this is a contemporary person in our community, I guess Edmond, North Oklahoma City, mother of 2 small children. We walk into the sanctuary, start down the center aisle, and as we take about 3 steps in, she just begins weeping. Fast forward an hour later, after she's gone, a husband and wife and 3 children walk in wanting to know something about the Orthodox Church. The 18-year-old son with them had been investigating it, and the family wanted to see what their son was getting into, I think. But they were not just here as spies, they were interested themselves from what their son had told them. I gather that they are quite active, as the other lady was, in their churches and doing, participating in leadership classes of some sort. And when we walked into the sanctuary with this family, we get about halfway down, and the man looks at me and says, you know, in the church that we go to, we pray every Sunday for the God to send His Spirit upon us in our worship service. We ask God to come. He said, you don't have to ask him to come when you walk in here, he's already here. Two separate incidents happening today that both simultaneously bear witness to what it is we're talking about in this class. Now, you are the choir. You are believers. You may not understand all we're going to be talking about yet, but you're not here as a skeptic. However, we are surrounded by a culture that would say those two episodes today were nuts. They were over-emotional. They had to have been on drugs. What were they smoking when they walked in? Our culture denies the validity of what I said I witnessed today. We discussed two different approaches to life in our first session. We put a label on them philosophically, not because we needed it, but we're talking to a larger world on that internet that's on this camera as well. And then last week we introduced ourselves to a Jewish man named Philo of Alexandria, who spent his adult lifetime writing in Greek, explaining mystagogically, that's a Christian word maybe, allegorically, the Jewish Old Testament, one, to fellow Jews who spoke Greek in the Roman Empire, the 6 million of them that did, and to the youth, the Jewish young people who were being lost to a Gentile culture, losing their Judaism, and his second audience being the Gentile world itself, in defense of the slander being said against what the Jews believed. We are doing the same thing or a similar thing in these classes. We are using the intellectual framework of today's world to communicate to our world the truth that we believe. That's what we are doing. We're using Philo as an example of how he did it. We've seen how last week in our time together, and I guess I didn't, you're going, whew, he didn't bring these markers, isn't that great? We saw how there was Palestinian Judaism and Hellenistic Judaism. And we saw that Philo was addressing the Hebrew Scriptures to a Hellenistic world, both the Jews and the Gentiles. We saw that he lived at the same time as Jesus Christ, the same time that the Apostle Paul was writing his letters, and that the Apostle Paul, when he went to the Jewish synagogues in the Gentile world, was going to Hellenistic Jews who were responding to the Christian message, and the Hellenistic Jews and the methodology used by the first Christians who were Jews were using a similar approach in those synagogues to tell the message of Christ. So, we're going back to the first century because it's the 21st century and it feels a lot like the first century. surrounded by a culture that thinks we're nuts. We're a small group of believers compared to the amount of people around us that aren't believers. And Christianity is getting a bad name from a lot of stuff that goes by the name of Christian, and we're wanting to say, that ain't us. Well, when people start throwing eggs, they don't care what your theology is. You're just one of them. So this is serious stuff we're doing, and so you can't just say, well, golly, when do we get to the liturgy? We're wanting to not only bring all of us into the liturgy, we're wanting to make it accessible to all of our neighbors that haven't yet knocked on our door as well, if that helps make any sense. And so tonight we're going to make use of Philo and some examples of how he shared the Jewish scriptures with a Gentile world and with fellow Jews living in a Gentile world. We're on page 35. Philo on Abraham. He wrote extensively on the book of Genesis and on the book of Exodus. Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. Now the Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. That's the scripture. But Abraham, this is the commentary, the moment he was bidden, departed with a few or even alone, and his immigration was one of soul rather than body, for the heavenly love overpowered his desire for mortal things. We're going to be reading faster than you can absorb, and I urge you then to come back later and be able to meditate on what's being said, and that'll become clear as we continue now. Philo continues, the migration, the movement, as set forth by the literal text of the scriptures, are made by a man of wisdom, but according to the laws of allegory, loving soul in its search for the true God. For the Chaldeans, that was the name of the eastern end of the Mesopotamia at the time of the first century and the time of Abraham. We would say the Babylonians, because that would be a later empire in the center that conquered the whole area. For the Chaldeans were especially active in the elaboration of astrology and ascribed everything to the movement of the stars. He's talking about where Abraham lived when God said, move. He's talking about Abraham's culture. They suppose, the Chaldeans, his culture, suppose that the course of the phenomena of the world, the visible movement of the world, is guided by the influences contained in numbers and numerical proportions. The Chaldeans, of course, had been the inventors of mathematics for Western culture. We give Pythagoras the credit for his theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. He got it from the Chaldeans. It came from Mesopotamia. They invented math so they could calculate the movement of the stars when it was cloudy and you couldn't see them, to predict where they would be when you could see them. I gotta hurry, I know, too much, sorry. The Chaldeans glorified visible existence, leaving out of consideration the intelligible and invisible. In other words, they only had a literal physical world. The Chaldeans concluded that the world itself was God, thus profanely likening the created to the Creator. In this creed, in that way of thinking, Abram had been reared and for a long time remained a Chaldean. He's part of his culture, just like everyone in the West is, and particularly United States, our version of Western. Then opening the soul's eyes as though after profound sleep, and beginning to see the pure beam instead of the deep darkness, he followed the ray and discerned what he had not beheld before. When I first read this, I'm going, this is not a typical Bible study. This isn't sitting around in the little church that I was raised in as a child, with a few of us around that little heater in the wintertime in the basement of a church, with 6 of us there reading the Bible one verse at a time and being asked to say, what does that mean to you? This is a level of talking about the Bible, I dare say, we've never experienced ourselves. And it opens our eyes to things we've not yet seen and understood, though we've all known the story of Abraham. Anyone who reflects on these things, the story of Abraham, and learns from no distant source. You're not going to learn from something else, but you learn from one near at hand, namely yourself, and what makes him what he is. In this case, what's happening to Abraham? Let's look at Abraham and learn something from him. What makes him what he is? If we do that, then we will know for certain that the world is not the primal God, if you don't do that, but a work of the primal God. If you look at what Abraham and what happens to him, you will learn that the physical world is not a God. It is the creation of the Creator, but a work of the primal God and Father of all, who though invisible, yet brings all things to light, revealing the natures of everything great or small. An invitation to say, wait a minute, don't go quote what somebody else says about Abraham. Let's learn something from Abraham himself, firsthand. You, me, firsthand. I'm just pointing us to what's there, so don't let me get in the way of you learning it firsthand. Chaldea, the land of Abram's birth, should be understood to be the culture in which Abraham was born, a culture that believed only the visible physical world existed, and in this culture's belief, it was the stars shaped and controlled the events in the affairs of mankind. His literal journey from Chaldea at the eastern end of the Fertile Crescent to the land to which God would bring him was a journey out of his cultural belief that only the visible physical world existed. He's making a journey out of a culture that denied the existence of God through his own encounter with that God who is the Creator God. How can we live inside the culture that's changing around us? Philo says, to the Jews living in the first century surrounded by a pagan culture, let's watch Abraham. Let's see what Abraham did and how he migrated from a culture into living within the visible and the invisible world. Aha! Maybe we're starting to say this might be of value to me. Every one of us is born within a culture and the beliefs and values of that culture. Like Abraham, everyone must make the same journey for themselves. We don't learn this from a distant source. We learn it directly from Abraham. Abraham made the journey from the visible to the invisible, that is behind the visible, and he made that journey for himself. Philo, in his encounter with Abraham, when he read Genesis, directly Philo reading Genesis, in his encounter with Abraham, he looked beyond the physical Abraham to the invisible one that was drawing Abraham to leave only a physical world and to enter a new world with both the visible and the invisible in it. If we only think literally, then he left a patch of dirt there and he moved to a patch of dirt there. He just changed physical, geographical locations. When Philo reads the same story, he goes, he left a culture that denied the Creator God to enter a new culture that worshiped the Creator God. Wow, what a way of approaching Scripture. A brand new way that gets beyond the visible to see the invisible that's behind the words in the first place. Likewise, we also do not learn information from Philo, who is our distant source. We're just not going to say, well, now Philo said, No. Then you miss the whole point of what Philo is saying. Anyone can say Philo says, but let's do what Philo does. The point is for us to see past Philo the way he saw past the text, the literal words. And when he saw past the words, he saw Abraham. Is that too confusing? And when you look at Abraham, you go past him, you see the invisible one who has called him forth. Let me say it this way: experience comes before words. Experience comes before words. Those two separate couples today, standing in the center aisle of our sanctuary, had an encounter with the invisible presence. They could not put it into words, though they tried. The experience comes before the words about the experience. The words are literal words you can hear. They are literal words on a page. They're literal the same way this is literal. And if I say there's only a physical world, there's only this and there's only words. But if there is an invisible Creator, The invisible Creator stands behind this stuff, and likewise He stands behind the written words about the experience. That's a leap, I know. Abraham had to leave where he was so he could go where he was created to be. Now, if you're starting to get a little uncomfortable, that's a good thing. Because you see, suddenly, we're no longer talking about Philo. We're no longer talking about Abraham. We're talking about us. Oops. I'm living in Chaldea and I'm kind of comfortable here. Oops. I kind of like my stuff. I can put up with the world. Yeah. You get it? Well, maybe I'll just stick around stuff anyway. I don't know. Philo, golly, what are we talking about him for? You see, we must see for ourselves. And as we are able, each one has got our own abilities and our own limitations. We don't all see what everyone else sees, but we can see something for ourselves. You see, it is one thing to read Philo and know Philo understood Abraham's leaving his hometown. I can read that. I can understand that it's a cultural migration, not just a physical one. He was physical, but it's cultural. It was a migration from an empirical-only culture into a culture that was both visible and invisible. I can say that. Yeah, that's what he did. But you see, it's quite another thing for us to hear the call, and likewise ourselves depart our empirical-only culture. We have to live in it, but yet I don't really have to live in it. You know, everybody here saw Star Wars, at least the first 3. Thank you. And you remember that first time when Luke and Obi-Wan Kenobi, they're walking, they're visible, and they're coming into whatever and the guards are there, and they just kind of passed right on through. They were there, and yet they were still who they were in the midst of a different world. I can't describe any of the experience, you see. All we've got are our words, and our words don't ever do justice to it. To move in and say, I can live here, but I'm not of it. I'm in the... It is quite another thing for us to hear the call, and likewise ourselves depart our empirical-only culture, and like Abraham, migrate, begin to move, not knowing where he was going, looking for the city which has the foundations, whose architect and builder is God. It's a mystagogic migration we're talking about, not just a physical movement. We are in the world, but we're not of the world. That's the migration. I'm in it, but I'm no longer of it. Wow, page 37. Philo, on a different passage, on Abraham. Abraham sees God, or did he? What about sight? He who sees God. Now the sight of the eyes is the most excellent of all the senses, since by it alone we apprehend the most excellent of existing things, the sun and the moon and the whole heaven and the world. But the sight of the mind the dominant element of the soul, surpasses all the other faculties of the mind, and this is wisdom, which is the sight of understanding. You've got physical sight and see physical things, great, but the sight of the mind that can see how things are connected and apprehended is the greatest sight of all, he says. But he to whom it is given not only to apprehend by means of knowledge all else that nature has to show. It's nice to know everything. You can go to school and learn academically about nature and life and all that stuff. But in addition to that, also to see the Father and Maker of all, that person may rest assured that he is advanced to the crowning point of happiness, for nothing is higher than God. And whoso has stretched the eyesight of the soul to reach him should pray that he may there abide and stand firm. Now, have you noticed you feel like he's talking to us? Or he's talking to me? You? He wrote that 2,100 years ago. And he's talking to us in our culture, right? You can hear it. You can apply it. And he wasn't writing to Christians when he wrote it. He was writing it to fellow Jews living in a pagan Roman Empire. That's why we're reading Philo, because here is someone talking about the biblical God to his culture in language and terms the culture could understand it, language and terms that the youthful youth inside Judaism that knew how to think all this stuff that way, they could comprehend it, and they could stand against someone that had their arguments against the God who is God. If he's speaking to us, he spoke then. Wow. So maybe we ought to just pay a little attention and learn something from Philo after all. Goodness, this is strange. Seen by Abraham. Genesis 12:7. Then the Lord, this is the English translation in our Bibles, then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. God, it says, quoting Philo, was seen by Abraham. Now you've got a footnote there. You see, Philo is using the Septuagint, and the Septuagint uses a passive was seen rather than the active saw. Was seen. It was a passive something. Abraham is passively receiving something rather than seeing it in an active sense. Because it's translated from the Masoretic text, the newfangled version that's in existence in our Protestant Bible. Sorry. So Philo then says he was seen by Abraham. This shows that God had not been manifested to him before, back when he was in Chaldea. He spoke to him invisibly, heard something stirred in him, and he left. When in his Chaldean way, he was fixing his thought on the chorus movement of the heavens and the stars, with no apprehension at all of the harmonious and intelligible order of things outside the world of the senses. He was just living in a physical world when he first moved. But when he had moved, Abraham got up and took that first step away from and changed his habitation. the world in which I'm wanting to live. He could not but now know the world is not the sovereign, all there is, but now he would know the world is dependent. It is not governing, but the world is governed by its maker and first cause. And his mind then saw for the first time with its recovered sight. Suddenly he's no longer seeing just visible stuff with visible eyeballs. He's beginning to have his mind be able to see the invisible working, the hand of God, however you might want to try to put it into words. For before a great mist had been shed upon our minds by the things of the senses, it's shadowed over, it's in front of us. It's like having dirty glasses and you can't see till you clean the grime off of our glasses. And only with difficulty are we able to dispel the mist under the warmth and fervor of higher truths. Take some hot water to clean those glasses sometimes. And be able, as in a clear open sky, to receive the vision of him who so long lay hidden and invisible to us. There is a process and a growing of eyesight, spiritual eyesight, if you want to call it that, eyesight of the soul, beginning to have the mist, the dirt, the grime removed, and beginning to learn how to see with those new eyeballs. He and his love for mankind, when the soul came into his presence, that is, God, and it says in his love for mankind, it's a wonderful way to translate it. The actual word is the Greek word lover of mankind. God, the lover of mankind. We say it again and again and again in our worship service of the Orthodox faith. In our hymnology, not every Sunday, but it's there over and over and over. Our only lover of mankind. God in his love, the only lover of mankind, when Abraham came into his presence, did not turn away his face, but came forward to meet him and revealed his nature. So far as the beholder power of this new sight allowed. That's a promise not only to Abraham, but to us. You get it? It's not just looking at somebody else. It's if we're there beginning to experience what Abraham was and we begin to see it, then some sight just started happening to us as we meditate on this. That is why we are told not that the sage saw God, but that God was seen by him, the passive side. For it were impossible that anyone should by himself, well, I'm going to go find God by myself, and just it doesn't happen that way. Apprehend the truly existent. Therefore he did not reveal and manifest himself. And we're going to have one final example right now. Let us consider one last example from Philo to illustrate Philo's use of the biblical text. The words of the Bible were not an artifact and end within themselves. For Philo, the words of the biblical text were an interpretation of an experience. Words are an interpretation of an experience. For the mind, unable to report the thoughts stored up in it, employs speech, which stands hard by, as an interpreter for the making known of its experiences. Those people there today were attempting to make known what they were experiencing. On the second couple, the first lady, but the second one was a couple, and as the man sought words to put it into, his wife just sat there and smiled this big smile of basking in the experience. She was enjoying the experience, letting her husband try to put it into words. The interpretation, our words, is like a shadow or a copy of the experience, while the essential bearing of the matter, interpreted by our words, resembles the original. Aha, what in the world is that? It's this: if we read about Abraham, and I'm not stopping with the words, Abraham had to tell the story. Moses has written it down. We've got words after words, but if I go beyond them and I get to Abraham, and Abraham then points me to the presence he is experiencing, so that in some ways some of the grime begins to be pulled away from my own eyes, of my mind, my spiritual eyesight, and I get a glimpse, then trying to tell you about it again is going to be a way of it resembling what I saw, the same way we have an encounter with the original event in the first place. I know, wow. For a shadow to be looked upon as of more importance than the body creating the shadow itself. Words are but a shadow of the experience. I'm saying it again and again because he said it again and again. We live in an academic world, and if it's not in words and in a book and you don't memorize it, you're ignorant. Right? That's the world we live in. And so, wait a minute. Every word in a book is but a shadow of the thing that's being talked about. And if you can get beyond the words, you can get to the thing itself and have your own, aha, now I know what someone's talking about because I've had the experience that these words are a response to. I've seen the shadow, now I've got the real in its place. Therefore, Philo takes us behind the shadow of the text, the shadow of its words, to the reality, to the experience behind the words. We're going to give one final example. Our final example comes from Philo on the life of Moses. Over in Exodus, we've talked to a couple examples out of Genesis. And if you're wondering why all this talk about the text and the experience behind the words, when you open the service book to the Divine Liturgy in our sanctuary, what's printed on that page? Words. Words. Right? Words. If we don't learn to see behind the words, how are we going to understand what's happening in the Divine Liturgy? Ah. This is deep stuff, Maynard. I know, I'm sorry. I'm having some fun too, come on. Life of Moses. The Israelites, having escaped from Egypt and Pharaoh, had arrived at Sinai, Exodus 20:21. This is a verse that if we've read the story, I guarantee we have skipped over and have no memory of ever seeing this verse. So the people stood afar off on the Mount Sinai, but Moses drew near the thick darkness where God was. Moses entered, we are told, into the darkness where God was. That is, into the unseen, invisible, incorporeal, and archetypal essence of existing things. Thus he beheld what is hidden from the sight of mortal nature, physical eyes. Philo also comments on this same passage in Exodus in an entirely different writing on the change of names, a passage in which he first comments on God appearing to Abraham in Genesis 17:1, before commenting on Moses in Exodus 20:21. Yet do not suppose that the vision was presented to the eyes of the body. We're talking about Moses on Sinai. They see only the objects of sense, and those are composite, brimful of corruptibility, while the divine is uncompounded and incorruptible. It is the eye of the soul which receives the presentation of the divine vision. Moreover, what the eyes of the body behold, they apprehend through the cooperation of light, and light is something different from either the seer or the thing which is seen. What the soul beholds, it beholds by its own agency without the assistance of any other. What the soul sees doesn't need the physical sunshine or electric lights to show us. We don't need light to let us see with our soul the way we need light to let us see with our physical eyes. We can enter into the darkness and then see. For the conceptions of the mind are a light to themselves. And so when you hear that God was seen by man, you must think that this takes place without the light which the sense knows. For what belongs to the mind can be apprehended only by the mental powers, and God is the foundation of the purest radiance. And so when he reveals himself to a soul, the rays of light that God puts forth are free from all shadows and of intense brightness. That spiritual light is a different light that has no darkness. Do not, however, suppose that the existent, the one who is, which truly exists, is ever apprehended by any man. For we have in us no organ by which we can envisage it, neither in sense, For it is not perceptible by sense, nor yet in mind. God is beyond our comprehension, whether physically or spiritually. So Moses, the explorer of nature, which lies beyond our physical vision, Moses, who, as the divine oracles tell us, entered into the darkness, by which figure they indicate into the essence, meaning of existence as invisible and incorporeal. He searched everywhere and into everything in his desire to see clearly and plainly Him who is the object of our much yearning, who alone is good. Now you're going, okay, I've got enough. This is heavy stuff. What? This past Sunday was the Sunday after the Ascension. Next Sunday will be Pentecost. During Orthros, some of the hymnology was about the Holy Ascension after 40 days. The Ascension canons were sung Sunday in Orthros. Ode number 1, the first stanza, he once slow of tongue, that's a reference to Moses, right? He's told God, I don't speak, and Aaron became his voice, his speaker for him. He, once slow of tongue, in divine darkness covered, spake the law inscribed of God freely and clearly, for shaking off all defilement from his mind's eyes, he beholdeth Him who is the I Am, learning the Spirit's knowledge and mystery, and gave praise in songs divine. We sang that hymn last Sunday, talking about the very verse Philo's been teaching us how to read and enter into. We're not just talking something back in the first century any longer. We're talking something alive and well at St. Elijah Orthodox Church. In every Orthodox church last Sunday celebrated the Ascension last week. I got to hurry, don't I? Or shall we stop? Why don't we stop right there and take our break?
That's a lot of work.
Philo and Moses. What page is that on, by the way? 40. 41. Somewhere, depending on which edition you got. Page 40. Let's make some observations. Moses is the acknowledged author of Genesis and Exodus, and Philo treats him that way. Philo understands Moses as the author, putting into writing the experience of Abraham and God in Genesis, as well as putting into writing an account of his own experiences with God in the book of Exodus. Moses is a hermeneut, an interpreter, putting into words for others what was being communicated in their encounters with God. Notice that Philo was not content merely to quote the biblical text, nor did he see himself redefining what Moses said to make Moses acceptable 1400 years later. He did not apologize for Moses' quaint beliefs or religious perspective. Philo did not, as would be the case 1900 years after Philo, by commentators on the New Testament, Philo did not choose to demythologize Moses' religious worldview. In fact, Plato, it should say Philo, sorry about that. That's why the book is a rough draft, right? In fact, Philo did just the opposite. The pagan world was populated with many gods and goddesses. They were physical deities, but the ancient world did not have. From the founding of the first cities in Mesopotamia, the predominant belief was in the eternality of both these gods and the material world in which they lived. The gods were material, the earth was material, and both were eternal. The concept of creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing, was an unthinkable concept not only in Mesopotamia, but in Greece and the Mediterranean world of the Roman Empire. Everybody in the whole world except the book of Genesis believed that there had been always physical gods and there had always been a physical universe. Always. You know, we sing it in The Sound of Music, right? Somewhere in my youth or childhood, I must have done something good. What, for here I am standing here loving you? For nothing comes from nothing. Nothing ever could. So somewhere in my youth or childhood, I must have done something good. That's what the world sings. Genesis says, in the beginning, God created. The Greek philosophers found it impossible to think of nothing. Nothing existed. There was nothing. They can't think it. They couldn't do it. Rather than recasting the creator God of Genesis as only an artist, an artisan, a potter with the clay, creating pieces out of the existing stuff in order to make Judaism more acceptable. Oh, well, we don't believe in a creator God. He could have downplayed it. He didn't do that, making Judaism less likely of ridicule. Philo did just the opposite. Page 40, Philo and Plato. Though Plato and Aristotle lived within the Greek ontology, their understanding of existence, that the understanding of the world being itself eternal, they believed that it was eternal, but they disagreed on how you know things. Their understanding of human knowability. Plato believed in a dual knowability. The knowability derived from the five senses, and the knowability derived from the nous, the mind, the soul. There was rationality for Plato, the reasoning that was derived from the data, derived from the senses, and there was mentality. So there's rationality and there was mentality derived from the mind, the nous, noetic knowledge, if you want to use the Greek phrase here. There were therefore two ways of knowing, which produced two kinds of knowledge for Plato. There was rational knowledge and noetic knowledge. You might say there was rational and there was spiritual, but if you use the word spiritual today, you'll be mocked and laughed at. We don't have to use the word spiritual, but we can talk about that we have the dual way to know things, and that's another story. You'd have to read Paradise Has Two Trees to get the full story behind that. Aristotle essentially affirmed only the rational knowledge. He disagreed with his teacher Plato. There's only one way of knowing, and that's with the senses. Philo had a choice between two hermeneutical systems, two ways of understanding and communicating a text. Philo adopted a Platonic understanding. That doesn't make him a philosopher, though we call him sometimes the Jewish philosopher or the Jewish theologian, because he dealt with the language. He's going to use that hermeneutic, but he uses it differently than Plato. It's the hermeneutic that says there's the visible and the invisible. He's going to use that hermeneutic that was well known in the world to then speak about the biblical God of creation who created everything out of nothing. Rational knowledge, of course, remained linked to the senses. The nous, Philo identified with the human soul, a human perception of the spiritual realm. Noetic knowledge, Philo likened to the knowledge that the soul saw. So it's not academic spiritual knowledge, it's what the soul sees and you've mystically experienced in the encounter. Armed with the Platonic hermeneutic, that approach, Philo presented the encounters of Abraham and Moses with God within familiar Greek philosophical categories, familiar to everyone in his world that he's talking to, including all those Jewish young people living in the Greek world, the Roman world. The creator God of the Jews was not a visible statue God of the pagans. Beyond all human rational knowability of the senses, the creator God was knowable only noetically, experientially, by an encounter with God. In other words, Philo did not use Jewish religious terminology to interpret the visible written text of Moses. That interpretation by Moses of Abraham's and his own experiential, noetic, seen by the soul, experiences with this biblical God. He couldn't say, well, the Bible says. Nobody cared what that Jewish book said. He used the term noetic and a noetic God, and he was using an acceptable means of communicating to his generation and to his world without changing the reality of the content he was wanting to share. He didn't adopt his culture to redefine the biblical God, he used the terminology, categories of thinking of his culture to inform them of the biblical God. You see the difference? In one instance, we cave in and just embrace culture to doing its thing. Philo didn't do that, but he learned how the world thought, and inside its thinking categories, then shared the biblical God with them and with his Jewish youth, so they could have an answer to that pagan world mocking them for believing in a creator. He used a hermeneutical method, understandable by and familiar to both his non-Palestinian Jews and his non-Jewish Roman world. In plain English, Philo did not assume the acceptance by his non-Jewish audience of the Torah as a legitimate source of knowledge. The Torah says, as laughable as that is, someone saying the Bible says today is as laughable to my culture out there as saying, well, the Torah says. I was invited to speak at a thesis presentation at a university, and part of the basis of the thesis dealt with the role of women in religion. It was a women's studies program, and I was asked to speak in behalf of Christianity. I don't know how or why. I guess it was at least known I was a believer on campus. Somehow I still have a job. And before me there had been a lady speaking in behalf of Islam, and she had, is it hijab, is that what it's called? The headgear? And had been speaking, and then it was opened up. I gave my presentation, and then she gave hers, and then it was opened up from questions from the students' audience, most of whom were Muslim students, as it turned out. So I got no questions. I really didn't. There wasn't one question about anything I had said. Of course, I gave it from the Orthodox perspective, and Synethia and Parathesis and all that stuff. And anyway, but the lady began getting some questions, and they were questioning her understanding of Islam and the use of Islam in America today, and I don't know what all. And at some point she got extremely frustrated with being challenged, and she hurled back at the students, "Don't you believe in the Torah?" And I'm going, no. It's just a book, and the Bible is just a book in itself. It's just words printed. It's just a literal object. Sola Scriptura says, is a confession. It's the book alone. It's only not the reality behind the text, not the experience behind the text, not the presence of God in that sanctuary for those two separate couples today that met something and someone that moved them to cry or tears or smile bigger than ever. You only have words on the text. You got it? We bear witness to the presence of God, not to somebody said. Well, Deacon Ezra said, well, booey. What? Phooey on that. Who's he? I'm a nobody. All we can do is bear witness to the presence, point to the presence with our humble words, in the hope that somebody else looks beyond us and encounters the presence we're talking about. Or what happened when the disciples came and said, "We found him who you're looking for"? And they said, Jesus said to them, "Come and see." How do we get somebody? Come and experience the presence of God for yourself. I have to use some kind of words, and I can just say, I don't have to say the presence of God. That may scare them off, right? But I can say, come and see. Come and see. Come to the classes and find out something. What? Not just information, a witness to the presence. That's what we're doing. We're learning how to share this. No, we're learning how to experience and recognize the experience ourselves. And realize we can't explain it, we can't describe it, we can point to it. There's absolutely no way with rational knowledge you can convert anybody. A man convinced against his will remains unconvinced still. It's just the way it is. You can't beat somebody up with a book. Even the church fathers. You can't do it. It doesn't do anything except make somebody hate God. You Bible pounders. You got it. You see, we bear witness to the encounter. Something happens down that hallway in that sanctuary. And we're going to bear witness to that which happens there when we finally get to near the end of why we're here. We're making our journey little by little, getting us used to casting off and leaving. We are migrating with Abraham from where we were to where we're going to be in these classes together. I think that's what's happening. And I'm grateful you've come back again I better finish, hadn't I? Philo was not simply transmitting the biblical text. Philo pointed to the experience behind the text and to the presence within the experience. Philo sought to do what Moses had done, which was to transmit that it was God which initiated the experiential encounter with both Abraham and Moses. And by so doing, number two, for the purpose of creating the possibility that those in his audience, Philo's audience, might themselves firsthand such an encounter. It was not an encounter with the Torah, but an encounter with the living existent. By the way, that's how the translator translated Ha'on, I am that I am, that God said to Moses in the burning bush. We'll get to that later in another session. But an encounter with the living Ha'on, that this Hermes, the hermeneut of the first century Philo, delivered his message from the God he himself had encountered. Everything we've read of his this evening was what he experienced about God when he read Genesis. He shared his experience that happened when he began to not use his physical eyes, but the eyes of the mind, the eyes of the soul, to apprehend the presence of God at work. Abraham, leave. And what was happening? He shared his encounter with the living God that Abraham was encountering, that caused Abraham to move. And because he did, maybe tonight we have, in some small way, begun to experience an inkling of the presence ourselves with it. I realize that's the end of chapter 2. If you want to stay for another 20 minutes or so, we'll go a little further. Is that okay? Then we won't quit short tonight. We'll go. You'll love me for it at the end of August. I hope. Or throw rocks at me one. Chapter 3, Philo and Christianity. Philo and Christianity. Philo was a contemporary of Jesus Christ. We're on page 43. The apostles and the birth of Christianity within first century Judaism. Paul wrote his letter to the Galatians, the earliest Christian writing in the New Testament, near the time of Philo's death, around 50 A.D. The distinguishing physical characteristic of the Christian sect was its inclusion of non-Jews as members. Christianity, for the most part, remained a Jewish sect within Judaism until the imperial policies of Emperor Domitian, 81 and 96. He was the one that imprisoned the Apostle Paul. The imperial policies of Rome forced the church with its non-Jewish members out of Judaism. The Jews didn't kick us out. Rome forced them to kick us out. We dealt with all of that in one of our other studies we've had. I think maybe it might have been with Domitian. The church, now let's just understand us. The church, though born in Palestine, flourished in the non-Palestinian, non-Jewish world Philo lived in. The world that Philo worked in and the world he died in. Palestinian rabbinic Judaism that was given its birth and created in Yavne after the destruction of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem in 70 A.D., rejected Philo and his conversation with his Greek-Roman world, and they chose instead, the Palestinian rabbis chose instead to live as an ethnic ghetto religion within the Roman Empire. As such, they had no need for Philo. Now let me just, look here. I get to do it after all. I hope you can see. If we have the Jewish timeline, and I know I blocked half of you away, I'm sorry, but if we get the Second Temple period, it's 516 BC to 70 AD. This was BC. This is when they came back from Babylon and they rebuilt the temple. It becomes Herod's temple eventually. He rebuilds Zerubbabel's. And so this is when you have Judaism. Christ is going to be born here. It's actually born in 4 BC. And so this is when Christianity, I know people hate the word X, but when you're writing in a seminary and you've got to write the word Christian and Christianity, you just need to use the X for Christ. It's not an obscene thing in a seminary. So Christianity is being born here, and in 70 AD the temple is destroyed forever and ever and ever, and then by 90 AD over here you've got Rome dictating who was a Jew and who could not be a Jew is happening. So this is the birth here of Christianity. And inside this, we have a world that's going to be, let's just do it inside Christianity right here. You're going to have Palestinian Jews, and you're going to have Hellenistic Jews that are here. The Hellenistic Jews speak Greek. We're going to have Pentecost Sunday on Sunday, and you're going to hear the story again and again about how when the Holy Spirit fell upon them, they heard it in their languages. Those are all languages inside the Roman Empire and outside of Palestine. That's Hellenistic Jews that were there for Passover, had remained, hadn't gone home yet, that are going to hear the gospel and respond, etc. We're inside. This is us. Everything we've talked about is us inside Hellenistic Judaism, because they said non-Jews could be part of the kingdom. And so, wow, we're coming into this kingdom, those of us that aren't Jewish, which I assume is all of us in this room tonight. So this is going on, and so you've got Hellenistic Judaism that's happened. And then in 70 A.D., the Palestinian Jews have just finally said, we don't like Rome, and we want God to come back and destroy them and bring in the eschaton, the kingdom. Well, Rome showed them a thing or two and wiped them out. There's never been a temple since in Rome. And at that point, Palestinian Judaism changed itself and became Rabbinic Judaism and retreated to using Hebrew and began creating a new Bible. It took them almost 1,000 years to do. The present Tanakh that the Luther used for his Old Testament. So that's this group. They threw out the Septuagint, out Philo, because he wrote in Greek, and he wrote so that non-Jews could hear about the biblical God. So that leaves Philo hanging out here, as it were, except the church is Jewish. We're made up of, at first, all Jews, and then slowly began to get more and more Gentiles in. But the church is Jewish, and so after 70 A.D., you have two versions of ancient Israelite still in existence in the world. You either have Rabbinic Judaism or you have Christian Judaism. Which one is the true continuation of the faith of Abraham? And the God, he believed God, and it was counted unto him as righteousness. Philo talked about Abraham, he talked about Moses, and he talked about the very ones that were receiving and hearing the message of the apostles in the Roman Empire. So, of all things, Philo is going to become part of Christian Judaism. It is going to be the Christians who are going to save Philo and his works from being thrown away by the Jews and lost in history. I've jumped ahead, but that's just the way it works sometimes. I don't know what page it is, but the Christian church became the primary preserver of the writings of Philo, who was virtually unknown in the Jewish tradition after his own time until the 16th century. For almost 1,600 years, the Jews never heard of him, didn't know who he was. All this has changed today in the 21st century. Contemporary Jewish scholarship following the lead of Rabbi Daniel Boyarin, not only understands at least Jewish Christianity, as they make a distinction as opposed to Gentile Christianity. Gentile Christianity happens after 90 AD when Rome said a non-Jew can't be a Jew. A non-Jew, well, here's Christians and Jews and non-Jews worshiping together, and they said, well, then you're breaking the law, we'll kill both of you. So that the martyrdom of the church begins to happen at this point. So after 90 AD, you have Christian Judaism and Rabbinic Judaism, and you don't have any Jews left in Christian Judaism. So now it becomes made up primarily of Gentiles, and after another 1,000 years, we've forgotten and don't remember we're Jewish in our roots. And so you come to a class like this and you go, what? Where did all this come from? It's us. And it's in the life of the church, and it's embedded in our liturgy and everything that we do as well. Contemporary Judaism scholarship also accepts Jesus and his gospel as being Jewish as well. A new generation of Jewish scholars, among them Marin Niehoff, explore the sibling relationship Judaism and Christianity. Modern Judaism now admits Christianity is not a stepchild of Judaism, but is in fact a sibling. We're two sisters, two brother religions, both coming out of the religion of Abraham and then established by Moses. She explores this relationship of Judaism and Christianity that existed in the first century before the parting of the ways. Niehoff is regarded as one of the world's leading Philonist authorities on Philo. She's a Jewish scholar and is seen as one of the world's leading scholars and authorities on Philo. She is the Max Cooper Professor of Jewish Thought at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So they finally discovered Philo. She specializes in interdisciplinary research in Hellenistic and Rabbinic Judaism, as well as early Christianity and Greco-Roman culture. Her approach does not seek to discover if X influenced Y. Did Philo influence Paul, for example? Her approach is to compare Philo's hermeneutic technique in interpreting a subject to his Hellenistic world, to compare his doing it with Paul's hermeneutic technique as he interprets the same subject to that same Hellenistic world. For example, Niehoff compares Philo's discussion of Abraham with the first century Hellenistic world with that of St. Paul's discussion of Abraham with the same first century Hellenistic world. Notice the title of the article she wrote: Abraham in the Greek East, Faith, Circumcision, and Covenant in Philo's allegorical commentary and Paul's letter to the Galatians. That's unheard of. The article begins by quoting a American scholar, Gregory Sterling, New Testament professor at Yale Divinity School. Now don't lose me. Philo has not been used, this professor, Philo has not been used half enough in the study of the New Testament. Are the works of Philo important for our understanding of the New Testament and origins? I suggest they are. In fact, I think the Pauline corpus, the Pauline letters, is the single most important body of material from the Second Temple Judaism for our understanding of the development of Christianity in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Perhaps this will strike you as an extravagant claim in light of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Josephus corpus, writings of Josephus. I would not deny the importance of either of these collections for the study of the New Testament and Christianity. I am convinced, however, that the Philo corpus helps us to understand the dynamics of early Christianity more adequately than any other writings. I do not want to suggest that Philo or his writings was directly responsible for the development of Christian thought, but that his writings are a window into the world of Second Temple Judaism in the diaspora outside of Palestine that formed the matrix of Christian theology. It was that world in which Paul went. And it is in that Gentile world of the Roman Empire that Philo was at work before he died. The church is going to be at work. And so it's the same world for both the Christians and Philo in that 1st century. And so they're breathing the same air, and they're both speaking about the biblical God and the biblical faith to a non-Jewish world. They have all that in common, and so there's got to be some insights that gives us then into the life of the early church that's living in that same period, facing the same kinds of realities that we're blind to and ignorant of 20 centuries later. She says, rather than investigating whether Paul knew Philo and was influenced by him, I offer a different comparison of the phenomenon of what they actually said of the exegetes. While their literary careers differed from each other in volume and choice of genres, both Philo and Paul adapted their rhetoric and hermeneutic strategies to their changing audience. What did Paul say? To the Jew, I'm a Jew. To the Greek, I'm a Greek. To the Roman, I'm a Roman. I've got to learn how to share the truth of the presence of God and the resurrection of Jesus Christ to a Jewish mind, to a Greek world, and to a Roman thinking world. She says then, my analysis of Abraham's faith in their respective exegesis will therefore pay special attention to the specific context of each of who are they addressing, the context in which they're speaking. Finally, page 45, it is not our task. It is not our task to examine Niehoff's interpretation of Philo, interpretation of Moses, interpretation of Abraham, or to examine her interpretation of Paul's interpretation of Moses, interpretation of Abraham. Our task, using Philo as our guide, is to come to Abraham himself, and in the presence of Abraham, experience the presence of God, which Abraham was experiencing for himself. What he experienced, we want to experience for ourselves now. What is important is that Sterling and Niehoff, the two scholars we just quoted, have established the relationship that Philo was Paul's older contemporary who shared his Jewish diaspora background and interpreted the same Bible, namely the Septuagint. So the Apostle Paul and Philo are writing out of and commenting on the same book to the same audience. Additionally, Philo's earlier writings addressed the Greek East, while his later writings focused on Rome and the West. Likewise, Paul began his writing activity toward churches in the Greek East, Galatia, Ephesians, etc. Around the time of Philo's death, and he penned his letter to the Romans, the Latin West, a decade or two after Philo addressed the Roman audiences in connection when he went as that delegation to the Emperor Caligula we talked about before. It was the church that preserved the writings of Philo, not the Jews. Philo's audience, both Jews and non-Jews, was the same audience of Paul and the early Christian missionaries. Philo's choice of more accessible literary genres, his growing emphasis on the creation and God's presence in the world, his turn to conceptualizing Judaism in distinctly Roman terms, in addition to conceptualizing Judaism in distinctly Greek terms, makes his hermeneutic principle as important to Christians in the 21st century as it was to the church in the first. We can learn how to do it. Note, Rabbinic Judaism, birthed after the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 AD, rejected Hellenistic Judaism and Philo. However, as Niehoff points out, while the rabbis rejected making converts of non-Jews, they nevertheless embraced Philo's approach to living at peace with a non-Jewish world. Philo illustrates a form of Judaism that positioned itself within the general culture, embracing new historical and cultural developments in the world rather than opposing them. The rabbis who assumed leadership after the destruction of the Second Temple and the demise of numerous apocalyptic movements. We've studied that in the Apocalypse. Let me tell you, the fanatic apocalypticism wiped out Judaism, and eventually I think we talked about it last week, after the destruction of Jerusalem, so they made it to Alexandria and led another riot there and led to another slaughter of the Jews. And so she's saying, after the destruction of the temple and after the demise of the apocalyptic movements, after all that rebellion against Rome nonsense got out of the way, they worked the Jewish community in cooperation with Rome and engaged both Roman and Greeks in discourse. Philo's specific interpretations, as well as his overall paradigm of combining Jewish with Greek learning, thus remained meaningful also in Rabbinic Judaism. Whether or not Rabbinic Judaism knowingly embraced Philo in such practical terms, we leave for others to decide. It is certainly accurate that the churches inside Hellenistic Judaism certainly embraced his position. Not only the churches of the first century, but the church fathers of the succeeding centuries as well. The church fathers of Christianity, who established the parameters of the hermeneutical understanding of the God who is there, beginning with the Apostolic Fathers in 100 AD and ending with Maximus the Confessor in 662 AD. The Fathers embraced Philo and his Hellenistic Judaism as a genuine and legitimate hermeneutical method of proclaiming the message of the resurrected God to their Hellenistic world, beginning with Philo, but building on Philo with their experience of the resurrected Christ. The church fathers completed the overturning, conversion, and baptism of the Greek mind into the radical Christianization of Hellenism. To achieve the Christianization of Hellenism, the Greek fathers were the first to introduce into Greek philosophy the absolute concept of nothing. This opened the door for the biblical God who created the world out of nothing. Once in the beginning, God of Genesis was established, it became possible to speak of the Word, who was in the beginning with God and was God, of the Gospel of John. Philo of Alexandria, a Hellenistic Jew, began the initial steps which, in the hands of the church fathers, eventually led to the radical Christianization of Hellenism. There's scholars today that deny everything. They deny Christianity. They hold the positions of leadership at the secular universities that have religious departments, and they want to blame the church fathers for having Hellenized Jesus. It was the Greek fathers that instead Christianized the world and the philosophical thinking of the West that today has been thrown away, but was not thrown away in the last 1,000 years. Neither Philo nor the Christians of the first centuries changed their message to accommodate the attitudes of their culture. Underscore that. Instead, they communicated their message in understandable terms, for they were not ashamed of the message they shared, for it had the power of God to create believers. They did not need to change the message. The message would change their culture if they could only share it in terms understandable to their world. The resurrection hermeneutic, I didn't get there. We'll start there next week together, God willing. We're finally getting to putting all the pieces and getting to the Christian side of this. So God bless you for being here. I know it's really got hot today, and wish you a safe trip home. And God willing, and you're willing, we'll come back and do it again next Monday. Thank you very much.
Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the Trinity, one in essence and undivided.